Good morning. Let's talk about Nephite fortifications, shall we? And I am hoping that my memory isn't going to be distorted because I'm driving and I can't check what I'm talking about with my book because I don't have it here. So you can certainly see if there's anything that I say that is inaccurate, that is distorting memory of what's really there. It's part of this ongoing project I have of trying to sharpen and clean up from the tendency that I've observed of speaking from memory and especially rhapsodizing from memory and tending to wash out details and distinctions the way that, again, people talk about. The Book of Mormon talks about, mentions, or describes. I have found, to my dismay, that I've seen examples of people not making a distinction between mentioning and describing. People will say the Book of Mormon describes things that in fact it only mentions. It's kind of in a similar vein to how people seem chronically unable or unwilling to distinguish between, say, mental health and emotional ease. I fear that a lot of time when people are talking about mental health, what they're really talking about is emotional ease, and they're not making the effort to sharpen a focus and make a clear distinction. They're just following this human tendency to wash out details and distinctions into statements that are kind of vague. I read about some feature at some point in the Book of Mormon from some perspective. And so now when I talk about it later, I'm just going to kind of say the book talks about such and such. Just kind of smear it all over the place, right? It's just kind of like the Book of Mormon is just kind of like this kind of vibing, kind of boom, 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 boom. Here we go. It's Book of Mormon time. Anytime that the Book of Mormon field is humming, then these things are present because that's what the Book of Mormon says. Or you put it into passive voice. There's these human tendencies of just kind of washing out and making vague and distorting. So I was looking at fortifications, and there's something else that's in my mind that I was also thinking about mentioning or dealing with, and that will have to be at another time because it's just fled my mind, and it was fortifications that were mostly on my mind right now. And yesterday I went and I read and I made some notes and I thought about what I was reading and the notes I was making. So there's certain kinds of ways that you can fortify places, right? If you've got a place to live and you're afraid enemies might attack, kind of the most easy and the most obvious, one of the most oldest ways is that you can dig a bunch of dirt and pile it up, right? And if you're going to dig dirt and pile it up, well, you're probably going to end up with some places where dirt used to be and now isn't. And so it sort of naturally follows that you could have a ditch and then a bank or a ridge, or what are the various words for it. You see these kinds of fortifications all over the place. And in places where people have a long time and kind of a long cultural continuity, and depending on the environment, you see examples of earthworks being present from a long time ago that people put in place for defense. But it's interesting how when Mormon is writing and he's narrating the history of the Nephites from his perspective, depending on his sources, he never describes, he describes this kind of earthwork as an innovation. When it's in the Amalekite-Amaron War, it's this Captain Moroni devises this strategy, this plan to fortify Nephite cities in a certain way. First, he starts digging up these ridges or banks. And what's the citation? The first thing that Mormon talks about, I just want to, I'll get in with this. The first thing that Mormon writes about is that Moroni is digging up and then putting up stone walls. And then he specifically mentions Ammonihah, rebuilding Ammonihah. That was the other thing I was going to talk about. It's so interesting that the Lamanites decide to attack Ammonihah, which is kind of almost in the Nephite heartland. It's not a southern frontier. Anyway, that might be something else. And that was about the different, lots of things that are going on behind the scenes that Mormon doesn't mention because that's not his purpose. But so the first time that Mormon mentions these fortifications, he says Moroni is digging and building stone walls. Stone walls take a lot of time and effort to build. I mean, you have to get the stone, so you have to either go gather it if it's lying around, or you have to quarry it and move it in, and it's laborious, and you need skilled masons to do all this. And it does seem, from the way that Mormon narrates all this happening, that Moroni kind of abandons this stone wall business pretty early on. By the time he gets to fortifying Ammonihah, he just goes with earthworks, with the deep fosse, is that the right word? And a high bank, like really high. So it's not just a slight embankment. It's some serious deep and high and impediments to the movements of those who want to attack the city. And of course, this is a lot easier than building a stone wall. All you need is a bunch of guys to dig and pile up. And there's some skill in shaping the earthworks and all this, but it's not as demanding as building a stone wall. And so you can do it in a lot less time, which is what he needs. He needs to prepare quickly. Okay, that makes sense. What's weird about it is that this most primitive way of fortifying a place, Mormon tells us is an innovation that it was never known among the children of Lehi. So up until whatever year of the reign of the judges this is, after 400 years maybe of the old monarchy, there had never been anybody making these kinds of fortifications before. There'd never been anybody that had this idea of, let's just do this basic, obvious technique of digging and piling up dirt. Why? We have mentions of the city of Nephi-Lehi and the city of Shiloh having walls. Zenith talks about repairing their walls. And so, at some point between the initial split in the Nephite settlement of the land of Nephi and the exodus of Mosiah I, they built some kinds of walls around their cities. Now, they had come from a city that was walled. Would they have had any experience with defensive earthworks of a primitive sort, let's say? Maybe not. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, I don't remember right now what kind of offensive siege works they were doing. If they were digging trenches or ridges or whatever the kind of siege warfare that the Babylonians practiced. But those were offensive measures that were undertaken by a very large and developed and complex civilization that was capable of deploying and maintaining a very large standing army in the field for months or years at a time. So, did that not exist? Did neither Nephites or Lamanites actually get to a point in the first 500-ish years of their civilization's existences where they got big enough and developed enough that they could deploy the kinds of armies that would dig siege works, or that would just dig dirt around their cities for defense. Okay, I mean, if the Lamanites for hundreds of years had reverted to let's just say more primitive way of doing things. I mean, if they apparently lost textiles and metallurgy and reverted to kind of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And I mean, if they were really that numerous, how numerous? Whoever got an accurate count of the Lamanites? Like, how would you do that? How would you, if you're the Nephites and you know the Lamanites hate you, and whatever, you know, they're going to send raiding parties against you, and you're always having to defend yourself against them. Are you going to be able to send spies regularly to get an accurate count of them? I mean, Zeniff was a spy when they went on that campaign to do the retaking of their homeland after they, so soon after they'd been driven out. So there's that concept of spying. But how often would they have been able to send the kinds of spies to get an accurate count? Can we admit the possibility of a lot of the reporting? Again, we have the combination of small plates authors writing from their experience and Mormon writing from sources. So can we hold the possibility that a lot of their perceptions and their reporting was inaccurate, subject to these limitations of human cognition that tends to distort perception, distort memory? In any case, although the Nephites were familiar with the concept of building walls around their cities, they had never actually gone through with this basic tactic of these defensive earthworks until Captain Moroni came along during the Amalickiah-Amoron War. And so there's the Ammonihah defense that's just the earthworks, and then Mormon innovates by adding the timbers and the pickets to the earthworks. And apparently he kind of goes with this basic, the ditch, the ridge, pickets, or the timbers, pickets, and then towers, presumably built of wood as well, because when you're doing it this way, you don't have time to build stone towers. So, you kind of think of something like Anglo-Saxon castle, or American frontier fort. I mean, it's pretty basic. Again, it's not so much like the sort of thing that would be distinguished from one culture to another. It's just what recommends itself from a human solution to a problem done as affordably as possible and as quickly as possible with the materials at hand in your environment. After that campaign, after he gets into all the detail of the war chapters, I don't know what's going on in front of me here. Anyway, after Mormon gets done narrating this campaign in the war chapters, he does not describe fortifications again. Even now, you can check me on this. I hope I'm remembering right, because I looked at the Gadianton siege when he's writing about this, and Laconius gathers everybody together, and he talks about how they make this big fortification, but he doesn't describe what it's like. We can surmise that it's probably of a similar sort, probably defensive earthworks and things. The interesting thing about it is that when Mormon starts writing about his own time and his own experience, he's so very terse and lacking detail about his own military campaigns. And he does never mention any of the the sieges and the difficulties of trying to get decoy people out of their strongholds or fortifications. He never mentions fortifications in his own time. Now, of course, the Gadianton siege is pretty soon before Jesus comes, and however much they built of defensive earthworks, it's an open question, and it deserves a lot of careful consideration. During the earthquakes and all that, at the crucifixion, how damaging would those have been? I mean, if apparently those earthquakes had the power to bury some cities and maybe cause landslides to cover others, and so on and so forth, and there was burning, wood burns. Stone buildings don't burn, wood burns. So if all this happens, how much damage would these earthquakes be expected to make to all these fortifications that they had made for these previous wars? And after Jesus comes and after everybody's converted, what reason would they have had to keep up these old defensive fortifications from a time when there had been all this war that was now abolished because everybody was living peaceably? Might we not suppose that there would have been a reason for them to want to dismantle defensive earthworks from times past? Every valley shall be exalted and every mountain and hill made low. Might that not have occurred to them in smoothing out the landscape from these, old these old defensive tools of war? Beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks, and dig their, they might have extrapolated from that, and dig their fosses and banks into flat areas. I mean, it's kind of without precedent in a lot of parts of the world. Mostly human experience is just constant violence or the threat of violence, constant vigilance against the threat of violence. And so if there's this area of the earth that experienced this kind of real peace for this amount of time, I think it reasonable to suppose that they would have had an interest in digging down and flattening out old defensive earthworks. And then when they degrade again, for whatever reason, make of it what you will, but Mormon doesn't give any mention of he doesn't give any description of fortifications. He doesn't talk about fortifying Cumorah when they gather at Cumorah. I mean, they're gathering 4 years at this hill where the Jaredites had gathered 4 years for their last stand. And apparently the hill itself is strategic enough, but there's no mention of digging or building palisades or anything of the sort. Check, see if I've got it right or if I've misremembered. But as I remember looking, he doesn't make any mention of this. I'm trying to remember if at one point during the campaigns that he's part of, that they fortify. Do they fortify at the Bountiful Desolation line ever? Let me know in the comments, and maybe I'll write a comment. I'll go and see if he mentions them fortifying the Bountiful Desolation line after they're driven there. But for whatever reason, they don't fortify at Cumorah. Not that he says. Are they just demoralized? If they can, I mean, they might be demoralized. They're certainly immoralized at that point, and so I think they've got this. The account implies this sense of desperation. They know that the Jaredites, that the army of Coriantumr gathered at Cumorah and was all killed except for Coriantumr. Maybe everybody's thinking maybe I'll be the lone survivor like Coriantumr was. But that story of the Jaredites would have been in their national collective psyche, kind of like, or I don't know, stories about King Arthur or something. They would have been, and so, for them to choose that site, well, we're going to gather I don't know if it was a way of Mormons rubbing their faces in it, saying, all right, everybody, this is where we are. We're going to gather where Coriantumr's army gathered. We're going to take 4 years. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Oh, so, I don't know. Was it deep in their national psyche, or was it something that he knew about? Maybe they'd all forgotten about it. So he was able to pull this on them kind of as a trying to signal, look, it's happening again. We're gathering at this hill. Remember what happened last time an army gathered at this hill for 4 years? Who's to say? It's an intriguing possibility to hold. This or that. There's different things to imagine that might have been going on. But they don't fortify the hill. They just apparently are on the hill, and the Lamanites come up and massacre them. And if they were able to muster literally 230,000 people, men, women, and children altogether, numbering 230,000, over 4 years, would that not be enough time to dig up some defensive earthworks? Why wouldn't he mention it if they did? The Lamanites just being too numerous, they just swarm over? There's a lot of vagueness. And so it's important to just to keep close attention. If we were to want to look for traces of things that were built at that time, we should keep all this in mind. The period of time in which certain kinds of defensive earthworks, in which Mormon mentions those kinds of, I almost used the passive tense. I don't want to do that. The period of time in which Mormon mentions certain kinds of defensive earthworks. The period of time in which he does not mention certain kinds of defensive earthworks. What might have happened to the defensive earthworks that he mentioned as a result of the crucifixion cataclysm and as a result of the golden age of peace, in which people would have had an incentive to dismantle those defensive earthworks. His curious silence regarding fortifications during his own time. That would all have a bearing on what we would expect to find and the way that we interpret the kind of archaeological and geographical evidence that is available as we look and see what people have found as they've looked where they care to look. And remember about where people have not cared to look, and not expect to find things yet where people have not cared to look yet. All right, well, that's my thoughts about that for today. And I'll talk more about more of this stuff later. Thanks for listening.